Good afternoon. My name is Ola Tamanova, and I want to thank everybody who joins us at the Ukrainian Media Center Ukrinform. Today's day 488 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor, and I traditionally want to thank the mass media who tell the world the truth about our fight and heroic resistance. In this platform, we were discussing a lot the information war, its meaning in this war, Russians' propaganda that is used as the weapon against us. And now we will be presenting a research by VoxCheck and CBR, where they were trying to find out to what extent our Ukrainians are under the influence of Russian narratives, to what extent have they learned to distinguish them. Our speakers today are Svitlana Slipchenko, VoxCheck project manager, and joining us a little bit later will be Tetyana Sytnyk, head of B2B and Strategic Research at CBR. Ms. Svitlana, good afternoon. Good afternoon. So let's talk a little bit about this study. What were the preconditions and what has changed? Has the study really demonstrated that we have a lot to work on? Do we have any signals that raise concerns? Or we can say that Ukrainians have learned to discern Russian narratives and not to be susceptible to them. Yes, really, within the last year and a half, there was a number of studies that defined the index of media literacy of Ukrainians, what were the sources that Ukrainians used to get the news. And our goal in this research was to find out, on top of what we know from other studies, how the main narratives of Russian propaganda that circulate in Ukrainian information field, maybe not within the last half a year, so within the last 9 years, or maybe even from the moment of Ukrainian independence, and that was true within the last half a year. The state fights the misinformation very actively. We see the Centers for Strategic Communication and Countering Disinformation getting engaged in this process, independent information attacks, the civil society, journalists, even the activity of the Ukraine Media Center, for example. It all promotes the Ukrainian messages to counter Russian misinformation. And just yesterday, during Book's Answer Arsenal, in the panel about the scientific view of the world, we were saying that Ukrainians almost won the information war, almost have overcome the Russian propaganda, but our study has demonstrated that there is something to still to work with. There are narratives that got rooted within a number of years, and counteraction to those narratives was not enough. So now we have to work on discovery of those topics, unveiling those topics. So what are we talking about here? On the upper level, the Ukrainians already understand what is Russian narrative, but if we get a little bit more profound into the topic, so what are our mistakes in perception? First of all, I have to say that we were questioning not only Ukrainians who are in the territories under Ukrainian control, but also those who left abroad, mostly after the 24th of February, and who stay in the biggest countries which accept Ukrainian refugees, like Poland, Germany, Czech Republic, and we selected those countries according to the data from the United Nations, according to the distribution of the Ukrainian nationals. And we were breaking it down by different regions, by age of Ukrainians. Those factors are very important. What also influences is the sources that the people use for the daily consumption of their information, whether it's Ukrainian resources or foreign information resources, or those are just the friends or maybe pro-Russian resources that people watch to get alternative information, as we may assume. Such factors as gender, education, level of income influence less than those factors that I mentioned before. For example, as to the income, it's a very subjective factor in our study, so only in specific cases we can see some specificities. But if we proceed to the topics, 43% of those questioned in Ukraine and 36% of those abroad did not agree with the statement that neo-Nazi ideology is spread in Ukraine. This is one of the examples of the narratives that Russia tries to spread within the last 9 years, or maybe even more. Statements that the Ukrainians are Nazis, that the reasoning for the special military operation is that Ukrainian has to be denazified, and due to the fact that this narrative was spread a lot by Russia and there was no response from the state of Ukraine, there was no explanation coordinated in all levels, just like it happens now with the debunking of the modern narratives. Maybe this is the reason this topic got so deeply rooted in Ukraine, and many people both in Ukraine and outside Ukraine believe that neo-Nazi ideology is widespread in Ukraine. Another signal of concern is that almost a third of those both in Ukraine and outside Ukraine think of the revolution of dignity as a coup. This narrative is at least 9 years old, and Russia still appeals to the fact that the events of the years 13-14 were a coup, and a third of Ukrainians really understand it, and they do not understand the difference between the coup and the revolution of dignity. However, there are explanations by the politicians, politologists, communication from the government why it is our historic heritage, why it's an important historic event. Still, the belief in such narrative is still existing. Almost a quarter of those questioned in Ukraine and a third of those abroad believe that Russia fights NATO and West in Ukraine. That's another big narrative of Russian propaganda that exists for a number of years, but it was more active within the last year and a half. This is how Russia justifies their invasion, and it's obviously a narrative which was coming through pro-Russian sources before the full-scale invasion, and it still penetrates the information space of Ukrainians. And eventually what I was impressed with is that Ukrainians abroad quite actively react and believe in the narrative that the Russian speakers are oppressed in Ukraine. There is no such tendency in Ukraine, I mean among those living in Ukraine, and that narrative was activated during the adoption of the law on language, and it's one of the justification for the Russians why Ukraine and Ukrainians had to be liberated, as they put it. And I think that when Ukrainians stay here in Ukraine, they have empiric evidences why there is no oppression of the Russian speakers. They see what's going on in the country, and there is no trust in this narrative. So meanwhile, while you're abroad and you're only limited to the consumption of news, which can be pro-Russian too, even in European countries, even in local media, they may spread pro-Russian narratives. probably this is how this narrative gets believed in. So talking about the second narrative, about the revolution of dignity, and the first one about neo-Nazi ideology, do those audiences overlap that believe in those pro-Russian narratives? And if you may characterize them, who are those who believe in those narratives by their social status, age, category? So talking about the regional distribution in Ukraine, so the inhabitants of the southern and eastern regions are those who believe in pro-Russian narratives, and that trend was preserving before. If we see their choice of sources of information, unfortunately in those regions the support of pro-Russian resources was quite extended. If we remember the support of political parties, pro-Russian parties, just like now banned opposition bloc, had enjoyed the maximum support in the east and south of Ukraine. This is where those narratives get better spread, and such a skill as ability to discern propaganda from truth, those who say that they discern it worse are those who are more susceptible to those narratives. Those who assess themselves as people with a better ability to discern Russian narratives are really the one who discern it. I think that it's mostly related to the government work, to the government sources, when we have the news about the disinformation, instructions about disinformation coming from all sources, even in Telegram, which is still dangerous. There are the channels of the government structures. So what were Ukrainians consuming before the full-scale invasion, and what are they consuming now in terms of news? I think there was a research by Oksana Statovich about the sources of information where Ukrainians get it from, and it was found out that a lot of Ukrainians consume information from Russian channels or affiliated with Russia. Meanwhile, they don't understand that those channels are Russians or affiliated with Russia. Has anything changed now? Well, you know, from those stale trends, the older generation trusts more to the television. They watch the joint marathon, and it's a positive signal because the joint marathon is the provider of faithful information. It's a platform for spreading and dissemination of the verified information, and it's good because the older generation who has worse skills of verifying information with the digital instruments, they get more faithful information from joint marathon, and at the same time the older generation picks more Ukrainian sources, even online, talking about the youth apart from the social media. Again, this is already an accepted fact that the youth receives more information from the social media. They get more information from communication with their friends, and this is a case when the objective news may mix with the subjective assessments or evaluations or the views of the person who communicates those news. So those two categories are the targets where the state may aim their policy at, because there is no correlation about the sources of information that provide information to the Ukrainians for different age categories, and talking about the facts where Ukrainians were getting most misinformation from. Mostly Ukrainians were facing the narrative that Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate is being persecuted in Ukraine, and the normal religion is being oppressed, so to say. So the heuristic of this kind worked in this way, that when this questioning was done, it was going on in May, just a little bit later after the Easter, and people were remembering the most popular narratives that was circulating just recently before that. Another narrative is about the war between Russia and the countries of NATO, of the West, and Ukraine was used as just a platform for the war. And yet another one, people were remembering about the Revolution of Dignity. On this year, remember, on the 2nd of May, it was the commemoration of the tragedy in the Union's House in Odessa, and this is when Russia recalls how bloody Maidan was, how bloody the Revolution of Dignity was, what a bloody coup it was. So people were watching it on the news, and this is why they responded that way. Yet another number of statements is that Ukraine is on the brink of the humanitarian catastrophe due to the activities of the government. In effect, it's related to the decrease of the level of life of Ukrainians, which is going on in parallel with the war, and also that the sanctions harm the West more than they harm Russia, and that narrative is spreaded more abroad, which is quite noticeable, but Ukrainians still believe it, maybe because they don't trust enough that the West may influence Russia in one way or another. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Your questions, please. Good afternoon, Svitlana Tkachuk, Ukrinform. Miss Svitlana, I wanted to ask a question made of two components. The first component is, has Russia changed the methods of spreading their propaganda, specifically for those Ukrainians who stay abroad? And another part is about what should Ukraine be doing with those narratives which are deeply rooted, specifically for those Ukrainians who stay abroad. Well, talking about the Ukrainians who stay abroad and the methods of Russian propaganda, those methods did not change, not even within the last year and a half, but maybe within a number of years, because to influence that audience, Russia uses their traditional sources and methods. The controlled experts, the mass media under their control. I'm not only talking about the conditional Sputnik in Russia Today, who still broadcast regardless of all the bannings, but it's a wide network of local media. But even talking about the Ukrainians who, for example, do not know the language of the country they stay at, they may read in Russian, Ukrainian, or English, but even among the sources in Russian and English are those who repost Russian state media, those who repost Russian Today or Sputnik, or they just write the columns which are not objective at all or distorted according that they comply with Russian propaganda. Among the experts under control of Kremlin, they look like reputed people from outside who should look unbiased, but they still spread Kremlin's propaganda and narratives as to the Ukrainians in Ukraine and what we should do with those deeply rooted narratives. I'm not sure that there is a quick solution, just like there is no quick solutions for the policies of the countries. It's a gradual story. It's good if it works with the modern narratives of Russian propaganda. Like, for example, I haven't mentioned a single time a narrative about smuggling the Western weapons from Ukraine to the black markets, because Ukrainians have not even identified this narrative. It's a new narrative. It was worked upon by the information platforms, by the state sources, and Ukrainians just don't perceive it, but it's a very sensitive topic. It could be a sensitive topic that discredits the armed forces, the government, and undermines the faith in the capabilities of our counteroffensive or any success in the front lines. It evidences that the government with other institutions work synchronously, and a teamwork like that is necessary for other narratives. It's an active communication in all platforms, the elements of education in the school, non-formal education, inclusion of media and civil organization in explanation of the broad context. It shouldn't sound as if Russia lies and that's it, dot. We should spread more information people could analyze, could read and make a conclusion themselves why they were reading something that was not true before and now they have faithful information in front of them. Ms. Svitlana, in continuation of our conversation, I would like to just double check one thing. 29% of those questioned in Ukraine and 35% abroad did not agree with the statement that the revolution of dignity was not a coup. Can we say that the Ukrainians who currently live in Ukraine are, not to say susceptible, or susceptible in brackets, to the media literacy initiatives? Since they stay in Ukraine, that's an urgent task, a pressing task for the government of Ukraine, and this is why the level of media literacy grows among the Ukrainians inside Ukraine. And those who live in Ukraine, they don't have this necessity to improve their media literacy. So can we assume that when Ukrainians get back to Ukraine, we will have this problem of returning the narratives that lost their actuality within the last year and a half? Well, it seems to me that with the for example, if we take the narrative with the oppression of Russian speakers in Ukraine, when people stay in Ukraine and they have empiric evidences, when you can touch everything around you, it works even better than mass information or education campaign. The people have to live through the debunking of this narrative, so it's very probable that as the people start coming back, at some moment our average, our say temperatures, the level of media literacy, it may fall, but due to the personal communication, the level of media literacy may grow, so we may rely on the social aspect here, not like 100%, and the government still has to think about the policies of adaptation for those who come back home, or the internally displaced persons who may have the distorted view of the media and other information, and obviously about the reintegration of the temporarily occupied territories, where some people within months, some within years, ended up under the influence of Russian propaganda. Not in our study, not in other studies, I've never seen any evaluations of what's going on in the occupied territories, and it's impossible to measure, I'm afraid, but generally knowing how intense Russian propaganda is, I can assume that integration of those people into Ukrainian information space will be difficult and lengthy, and the government has to be prepared to this in cooperation with media and civil organizations and with international organizations too. Svitlana, when has the empiric experience worked in those issues with the narratives with the Russian speakers, and why it has not worked with the neo-Nazi ideology narrative? Why hasn't it worked for our internal audience? I can assume that it may be the lack of understanding of what actually Nazi and neo-Nazi ideology is, and people just subconsciously were identifying the expressions of the violent behavior of some social groups as Nazism, because this is how Russian propaganda explains it. Any expressions of violent behavior of Ukrainians to each other, any expressions of violent behavior of Ukrainian refugees abroad, any activities of our armed forces are interpreted by Russia as the Nazism. And due to this influence, which is on for 9 years, it may create impression that such ideology is widespread in Ukraine. Ms. Tetyana Sytnyk joined us. Good afternoon, Ms. Tetyana. I hope you're hearing and seeing us. Good afternoon. Ms. Tetyana, we would like to ask you a little bit about the techniques of the study and the conclusions from the point of view of sociologists. So what are they? So about the techniques used in this study, we were questioning the people in online panel. It was a half of our drawdown. In Ukraine, we were questioning by telephone. It was all down to make a representative drawdown for Ukrainians who live in Ukraine, so that the villages are represented, different regions are represented, and we were questioning the audience who resides abroad. Now they were asking, they were answering the questionnaire online. We were making sure that they reside in the countries where the most of Ukrainian refugees live now, and we also checked the region of their origin. So the questionnaire was developed by our colleagues from Vox Ukraine, but the statements were taken from the information space, and people were evaluating to what extent they correspond with their realities. So people were just saying to what extent that corresponds with their reality. It also could include their personal opinion and reaction to information space, what they get from information space. And we were also asking to what extent those statements are widespread and popular. So the statements were divided into pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian. And what's interesting that if we make a statistic analysis to recreate the structure of thinking, because when people were responding, they were responding to those statements randomly, but if we take the structure of thinking, we still see very clearly the pro-Russian statements and pro-Ukrainian statements. And what's interesting that among pro-Ukrainian statements, there are those two highlighted about the revolution of dignity and popularity of neo-Nazi ideology. They fall out a little bit from that list of pro-Ukrainian statements because they are a little bit older. They come from the times of revolution of dignity, and maybe because they are more, so to say, ancient in information space, there is a lot of ambiguity in the responses of our respondents. This is the first thing I would like to highlight from the sociological point of view, talking about the results of this statistic analysis. And another thing is that the perception and the support of pro-Russian statement, the higher support of the Russian statements or pro-Russian statements, is related to a lower self-evaluation as to the ability to discern the propaganda and misinformation, so that people who are less confident in their ability to discern misinformation, they have more proclivity to support pro-Russian statements. Those who rely more on their friends as the sources of information, specifically the youth, they will be more inclined to generate some Oh well, you've broken down for a moment. So yeah, I wanted to say that this ability to discern misinformation and the use of different sources of information, not only friends or family, and more attention to the analytical surveys, to the statements of experts, it decreases the level of support of pro-Russian narratives. Thank you very much, Ms. Tetyana. And maybe the last question is where this study may be found. It has been posted this morning in the voxukraine.org, and shortly it will be posted in the pages of our social media, Vox Ukraine, VoxCheck Facebook pages, detector of lies resource, and there is a lot more infographics described there than we can discuss in these 30 or 40 minutes, and the techniques and other interesting observations about other factors and narratives will be described there. For example, about the difference between the men and women, to what extent they personally think they may discern the misinformation, and what their responses show. Do the factors of income and education influence the ability of the people to discern misinformation? Ms. Tetyana, Ms. Svitlana, thank you very much for this broadcast. Thank you for joining us. Dear friends, don't forget that your critical thinking is a weapon too, so use it actively, and we continue working together for our victory. We want to thank our armed forces and security and defense forces so that we can work here, and glory to Ukraine.